I'm Samantha Brentmore, and welcome to the Rosemoor Roundtable, a limited discussion series hosted by myself and Rose DiOro, covering a range of topics specific to the romance audiobook industry. This fourth roundtable discussion is part 2 of a series on marketing in the audiobook industry. Specifically today, we will focus on the power and importance of reviews in marketing audiobooks. Today, we welcome 2 guests, each with a unique perspective on the topic. The Rosemoor Roundtable is recorded over a live stream and produced and distributed by Brickshop Audio in podcast form. And now, here's your moderator for today, Rose.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Hi, everyone. We're so glad to be back. It's been a while, and you may recall if you were here for our last roundtable, we had our first round of conversation about marketing, and we're back with round 2 today with Michele Cobb and Jen Prokop, and I'm going to turn it over to the 2 of them to introduce themselves, and we'll dive into our conversation. Jen, why don't you go first?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Prokop. I'm a podcaster. I co-host a podcast called Fated Mates. I review for Kirkus Reviews, and I also am a freelance editor. So I also wear quite a few hats.
Great. And Michele?
Hi, I'm Michele Cobb. I am publisher of Audiofile Magazine that does audiobook reviews. I'm an audiobook publisher myself, publisher of Insatiable Press, and I am the executive director of the Audio Publishers Association, among a few other things.
So many things. You both do so many things. I would love to just dive in a little bit deeper about the work you do, a little bit more about coming into the romance community, especially Michele. Why don't we start with you? Because you wear so many hats and it's not specifically romance all the time. How did you connect into the romance genre, and what elements of your work would you say are focused specifically on that?
So I have a very funny sort of long story that I'll tell you the crib notes of. I used to work for BBC Audiobooks America, and we would always talk about, I was doing sales marketing, selling to libraries and bookstores. We'd always talk about what else should we publish? What else should we publish? And around 2008, we started saying we should publish erotica. But we were a company connected to the BBC, obviously. So there are some restrictions.
Sure.
However, we were sold in 2010. And that's right around the time where erotica started to get big. And so the American division of the company said, no, really, we should publish erotica. So we actually started a whole separate company. And it's very funny to sit around a room and have a bunch of people trying to decide what the name of an erotica company should be. So everything, it turns out, is a double entendre in that situation.
As it should be.
Exactly, yes. And unfortunately, Audio Go, which was the company at the time, which had started Insatiable Press, didn't make it. And Insatiable Press was essentially abandoned in the sort of breakdown of the company because of its, genre. Not everyone was very interested in it. So myself and my business partner, who at the time, neither of us worked for Audio Go, we were the only 2 people who could sign checks or related to the company from the US. And to be frank, the company owed a lot of money to people that we knew. So we looked at each other and we said, we have 2 choices. 1, we could walk away, or 2, we could just try to figure this out. And like we were doing drug deals every couple of weeks, we would get together and both sign the checks. And it took us several years to figure out the ownership of the company and to take ownership and really just to continue to publish. And it's been a decade now. And,
wow.
We're just having fun. It's really our hobby, nights and weekends, where we do this along with someone else who helps us acquire titles. But yeah, it's really great. I get to give people, jobs as narrators, and I kind of like it, but it's just fun.
Yeah. Wow. And do you we'll get a little more into this in a minute, but since this is a marketing conversation, as the publisher, is your company involved with the marketing of those books as well? Can you talk a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, so we're very small, so we don't do a ton of marketing. We send out titles for review, because I'm executive director of the Audio Publishers Association, I don't submit my titles to the Audis,
Sure.
which is a great way to market them. Just try to maintain a little distance there. That's a hobby, nights and weekends. So we're not spending a lot of money in marketing. So everything is about, social media and really maintaining relationships with reviewers.
Mm-hmm.
So I consider reviews very important.
Yeah. Which is a great segue into some of those sort of deep dive questions I have for Jen. I'm really curious. I have a couple different questions for you just to kind of unpack a little bit more about the work that you do. But how did you get started as a reviewer for Kirkus?
Right. So my day job is as a teacher, and maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, I started reviewing romance on like blogs just for fun. My son was getting older, and I kind of felt like to use like a very old fashioned phrase, like felt like I needed a hobby. And I love books. So I was like, what book hobby can I have? So it's funny because I was like, well, I guess I could review YA, but then it would feel like work. So I was like, if I review romance, which I have loved my entire life, I can just like sort of lean into something I love that really will be for me. Like it cannot be something that becomes like part of my work life. So that was like really important to me. So I started reviewing for a blogger named The Book Queen. And for those of you that don't remember, like book blogs were a really big way that like romance readers interacted with reviews because so few mainstream places reviewed romance, right? And so it was around that time, like a lot of things sort of happened at once. I probably did that for 6 months. And I was contacted by Lori Muchnick, who is my fiction editor at Kirkus. And they were at the time or had been in the process of really trying to get more romance reviews into Kirkus Magazine. And so she was looking for people that could specialize in romance. And so I basically did a tryout for her, right? Like she sent me a book, and I Kirkus has a very specific format that is like 300 words, and it has like a really, it has like a header line and a certain amount of plot summary and then like sort of some judgment. And so it was that was the way I got started for her, was just because she was kind of out, I think, following romance Twitter, finding people who were reviewing, and then like looking for people that she could hire to work for her at Kirkus.
And you said that was around what time? What year?
My guess is like 2018 or 2019.
Okay.
So I've been doing it for quite a while.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about the power of social media and how it has shifted over the years and the power that it's held over the years. And that like even at that time, it's like not super long ago, but so much has changed in that landscape in the time that has passed, Right. I think it'd be harder. I guess I don't really know, but it seems like maybe it'd be harder even to find for someone to find you on a blog versus just like on your, your Twitter. Well, it wouldn't be Twitter anymore, I guess. Your Instagram account or your TikTok account or whatever the kids are doing these days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and so I think so one of the things that I think people don't quite understand about Kirkus is like Library Journal and Kirkus and Publishers Weekly are like the three, like they do hundreds of reviews a month across all genres. And the real audience for these reviews is mostly like libraries, right? Collection development librarians. And, like the general reader will notice Kirkus reviews like in the front of a book, right? Because I'm reviewing books months before they come out. So these are like advanced reviews as opposed to, this book is out now and I just happen to read it and enjoy it, which is more the kind of thing we do at Fated Mates.
Yeah. And I'm sorry if you said this in your intro before and I maybe missed it, but I know Kirkus, as far as I understand it, does not review audio.
Right. That's true.
Are you an audio consumer? Is that you do? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a real unicorn though, because I listen to audio books at 1.0.
You're not the only unicorn.
Okay.
I feel you.
Yeah. I mean, and so like when I'm driving the car, like, right, or I'm just doing So, I mean, I love audiobooks, but I read really fast. So if I want to consume something fast, I want to read it with my eyes.
Mhm.
For me, reading audio is just like taking a bath in language, right? I'm just like, let me just like, I love it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I have like kind of comfort listens,
Mhm.
romance audio I've listened to over and over again
Mhm.
when I just feel like marrying Winterborn is what I need.
And Michele, as we're moving into like the audio realm specifically, something I thought was really interesting about you, and I share this with you, is a theater background.
Yes.
Mine is as an actor, and I do theater, some producing now. But you, if I'm not mistaken, were more on the production side, or were you an actor as well? Are an
I mean,
actor?
I think if you study theater, you have to act
Yeah.
in some things for the most part. But my background was in directing. And, it's been great in being the executive director of the Audio Publishers Association, having to deal with hundreds of narrators. I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
I know you guys. You're actors. It's
Mhm. Mhm.
fine.
Yeah. And well, the reason it stood out to me is all the work that your work is so audio focused. And I was really curious, and you kind of just answered it, but like, was the draw for me, audio is a theatrical form. It's like although it's for me, it's more like if I'm listening, it's more like a movie in my mind than a play, I would say. And I think I've heard a lot of people say the same thing. But I was really curious if that was an element of the draw for you as well, or if I'm just projecting.
Yeah, no, it was. It's funny because I toured for a year doing children's theater where we did not like each other's music choices. So we
Mhm.
discovered together audiobooks. It was all abridged at that time. And then when I moved to Los Angeles and directed a few things, I was really looking for something else to do and ran across a company that records plays, many of them in front of a live audience, LA Theater Works. And I sold some tickets for them at night. And it was one of those funny situations where they're like, "You're not an idiot. Would you like to come and like pack some tape?" And I said, "Sure." And, I had some other jobs and one of them didn't work out. And I came into the office that day, having walked away from a situation a little bit visibly shaken. And they're like, "Oh, do you just want to work here full time?" So I said, "Sure." And, it just became, I had such an interest in learning new things that I knew the theater side of it. I knew how they produced the stuff. I didn't know the audio side. And they really didn't have anyone focused on the audio sales and the marketing of the titles. So over the course of 3 years, I listened to 300 plays on audio, plenty of time in LA to listen to stuff,
Mhm.
stuck in the car.
Yeah.
And just really became interested in the format, got to know people in the community. And it was a natural fit because I had listened to so many while I had been doing theater, and it is about performance. So it was really easy
Yeah.
for me to sell audiobooks because I'm like, oh, it's just reading with your ears, and there's a whole
Yeah.
nother perspective in. So for me, it was a super, super easy transition.
Mm.
And, I went as a young person, I read about a book a day. Jennifer, like you, I read
Yes.
very quickly with my eyes. And when I got into audio, it did cause me to slow down. And then as the growth of, our time on screens has happened and
Mhm.
having a child, I can read while I'm walking or
Yeah.
read while I'm exercising or read while I'm doing something else. So I've read fewer and fewer books with my eyes and more
Mhm.
with my ears. And it's been a really fantastic transition for me.
Hmm. Yeah, that really resonates with me. The sort of all the things that you can do, and I'm not a fast reader, even though I get paid to read every day. I'm quite a slow reader when um somehow I'm fast at recording, but when I'm just reading for pleasure, it goes very slowly for me. And I read a lot more when I'm listening to audiobooks, and I never have time to just eyeball read something for fun anymore because I'm always eyeball reading something for work. So it definitely feels like such a gift. And as a theater person myself, it's also just like, it feels like an extension of the thing that I love, this other thing that I love so much too. So that all really resonates for me as well. Um, Before we move out of this sort of breaking down both of your backgrounds a bit, Jennifer, Can you tell us a little bit more for folks who don't know about Fated Mates? Because that's a big part of what you do.
Yes. So one of the things and I guess one of the things that's really interesting, I would say for me, like in terms of like the way I review in those two different spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm reviewing for Kirkus, the Kirkus reviews are unsigned, right? So, and I signed a non-disclosure agreement. So like I can't tell anybody which books I reviewed. You're really speaking with like the voice of Kirkus, right? As opposed to like different reviewers. That allows me a little bit of freedom to sort of say like, this didn't work. When I'm on Fated Mates, which is a romance novel podcast, that's all we do. Talk about romance novels, and it's awesome. We really lean into talking about books we love. And it's not to say that there aren't times that we would sort of be like, there's this one part or whatever. But I find when you're speaking about a book, when you're recording yourself talking about a book, negativity can really slide into meanness very fast. And so, I've listened to other romance podcasts where I think people think and like, this is just like philosophically, I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong, but like, just for me, I love romance so much. And so like, when I hear people talk about a book, like there's a way that sometimes I'm like, you think you're kind of poking fun at it, but it's so easy to misconstrue as being, rude or mean or whatever. And it just has a very different tone, I think. So the biggest difference for me is like when I'm on Fated Mates talking about books, I am only talking about books I love, right? We're only talking about romances that we think are doing great work or that are like really exemplars of like whatever it is we're discussing. So we have like a couple different kinds of episodes. We do read along episodes, like a deep dive of a single book over one episode of the podcast over an hour. Then we do trailblazer interviews, which are like interviews with like some of the biggest names in romance, right? We sort of say the people that built the house. So we had like Nora Roberts on. If you have not listened to Nora Roberts' episode of Fated Mates, it is honestly amazing. She sounds like me, but like for real. And then we also do like trope episodes. So we'll have a whole episode that's just about like, I don't know, only one bed or forced proximity or excuse me, like whatever. And then we're saying, here's how this trope works. Here's 10 books that do it great. So it's just like we've really, I think, in our 6 seasons, hit upon a really good mix of the types of ways that we like to talk about books. And we will often talk about audio. We've had a couple audio exclusive episodes. We've had my co-host is an author, and we had one of her narrators on once to do a whole interview. And then if we have read a book in audio, we'll often talk about it. But it's not like a specific thing we do. Like, this is an audiobook you should listen to, but it is like an ongoing part of the conversation if we think the audio has been really great.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Michele, Audiophile has a podcast as well, and I've got some more specific questions I'd love to get into a little later in this conversation, but I think maybe this is a good moment to transition really more into the meat of reviews and the various kinds of reviews and places where you can find reviews. And while we're talking about podcasts, what would you say is, it seems to me like the podcast is really focused on highlighting certain reviews that have been published in the magazine. Is that accurate, would you say? Or is it a whole different thing?
So Behind the Mic is a daily review podcast. So it's like 6 minutes a day, trying to give you your sort of taste of what is coming. So all the titles that are covered on the podcast have been reviewed in the magazine, but it's a different take on them.
Okay.
So like, I'm not someone that writes reviews, but I'm one of the guests on the podcast each month. So each month I talk about 5 different titles that have a review. And then I'm talking about my perspective on it. What did I like? Me and the written reviewer may not agree on every point. But generally, these are things that we have both really liked because they're recommendations. And we do some longer episodes where we deep dive in with a narrator, an author, or both. But the meat of the podcast is really like, here is your quick, like, recommendation for the day. And here's why we like not just the story, but the narrator.
Which is a little like not all of the reviews that end up in print are necessary. Would you say, are they always recommendations or more just like, here's my thoughts on this book, which sounds like maybe a little bit different than the podcast?
Yeah. So the podcast is really sort of a lot of the cream of the crop. And there are reviews that, are imperfect or not great. And we try to be, as a professional review source, neutral and ensure that we're really giving a clear picture of what the experience is. Mm-hmm. So it may be that the text is amazing, but the narrator was miscast. Not their fault, but not a good match. Mm-hmm. So we do, definitely have those negative reviews. In the podcast, you're getting more recommendations. Yeah. Although I always like to say what I didn't like as well as what I did like.
Well, and that leads me to another question. So what would you say, that's an interesting point, right? To identify that for anyone who's tuning into the podcast and to include reviews in the magazine that are not necessarily favorable. Can you talk a little bit about like what the aim is for the publication, for the podcast? Who do you view as the audience for it? Is it the industry? Is it readers? A mix? Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. It's really, largely consumers because we are the number one source for audiobook reviews. We're reviewing thousands of books a year and, hundreds per month. And so we're trying to reach the consumer who doesn't have a lot of sources for audiobooks. Mm-hmm. Certainly people within the industry read, and I can always tell on Thursday when real-time reviews e-newsletter goes out because immediately everyone's tweeting or Facebooking or Instagramming their reviews. And we certainly have a lot of librarians that turn to us to, find audiobook reviews. But the majority of our audience is really those people who are heavy listeners who say, help guide me. There's thousands of choices out there. What should I really turn to? Or what, frankly, what should I not necessarily listen to?
What do I not waste my time on, perhaps? Yeah. And Jennifer, can you speak to that a little bit about Kirkus, like who the audience is and what the aim is for the publication?
Yeah. So, and I want to point out, I'm a freelancer for Kirkus. Sure. I'm not like the voice of Kirkus, but one of the things I think Kirkus does really well is they are extremely democratic, right? So there is a section. They cover all genre fiction. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. They cover children's literature and not just YA, but like picture books. They cover, mysteries and thrillers. And so I think their goal is really like, we are going to try to get as many of the books that are like, hitting the shelves from traditionally published, like New York houses. I think that's like the one thing that you cannot find at Kirkus is they don't review things that are self-published. Mm. So, it is only for like sort of the, traditionally published books. Like I said, I think a lot of the audience, I think Kirkus probably thinks of its audience for sure as like librarians, collection development. But a lot of people who are readers will also notice, like I said, if you like pull a book out, right? And it's like on the front cover, they have the, the kind of like blurbs or whatever. Like somebody said this, quite a few people who are like, who notice, that kind of thing will be like, oh, I'll pay attention if Kirkus says something nice about it. Mm-hmm. So I think for sure, like a kind of knowledgeable general reader also looks for Kirkus, like blurbs on books and things like that, because I do think we have a reputation, which I'm proud of, as being probably one of the I think we can go hard. Let me just say that. I think a Kirkus review can go hard. And maybe, some people don't like that, but I find that our reviews feel like, or at least let me speak from the I perspective. When I am writing reviews and I feel like I have the support of my editor to be like honest and fair. And that can sometimes mean saying that like something just didn't work.
I think it's interesting because I think one of the big differences for Audiofile Magazine versus many of the other review sources is that the audiobook, even when it comes out simultaneous, is not available to listen to for a review 6 months before, the way, an advanced reading copy is.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're working very hard, especially when the big titles are coming out, to get that audio as early as possible, which can, be a week, 10 days or after, or the day it comes out, and to, course through that quickly to make sure that all those big titles are getting reviewed as close to the simultaneous release as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting challenge. And we do have, a wide range of the big houses, a lot of independent audio publishers, and then individual authors who are having their stuff professionally recorded. That's all coming into the circle. So we're trying to balance all of those things and not having the 6 month to review. So
Right.
Now, is that seems to be changing a little bit? Like when you go to NetGalley, or I'll get emails from publicists, right? This is more, I think, on the Fated Mate side. Like I am assigned books to review by my editor. I don't choose them.
Mm-hmm.
yes.
But right, I just want to make that clear to everybody. I'm not like choosing. But it feels like is more advanced audio out there. Like NetGalley now has some audio. It doesn't seem to be like
advanced listener copies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there is some that's not always the human recorded
Okay.
copy that you will get, that the consumer will get. And it is coming a little earlier, but it is, and you talk to narrators, they talk all the time. It's like this big book landed in my lap and they've given me, I have 18 days to get it in, and it's publishing, a month from now. They couldn't plan this better.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is an effort to do that. But the problem is you have to have that final text before you can record the audio. And, it's always amazing to me as an audio publisher. We'll get something, and a lot of what Insatiable does isn't necessarily simultaneous release. So we might get something that's been out for a while, and the narrator's recording it, and they're like, do you know that this character name changes, at this point? And so going back to the publisher and saying, oh, hey, you might want to, fix this in your ebook. And, so, yeah, I think it's just a really interesting sort of conundrum we can't get it 6 months in advance, but we can listen. And we do encourage the one-time listening.
And Jen, actually, to speak to what you said, I can say from my own experience on the narrator side of things, that those early NetGalley releases, in my experience, have mostly come from indie authors who plan out in advance. I want to have some advanced listeners review this long before, like a month before, perhaps, which is a long stretch for an audiobook, before it actually releases. But I haven't experienced that with any of my traditionally published titles. So Michele, perhaps you would know more about that than me, but from my perspective, it just does seem to be when you have the indie author who has more control of the schedule of things on their end, and they know how long they take to write something and all of that they can kind of plan in advance. And then and then NetGalley seems to serve as a partner for them to aid in that experience. And that does seem to be kind of new, at least in the however 10 years, whatever, that I've been narrating. That feels like a newer experience to me, for sure.
Yeah. When I started in the industry 20 years ago, the book would come out, and then a year later, you would get the abridged audio. If you're really lucky, you'd get the unabridged audio. So.
We recently did an episode, a Trailblazer episode with Jackie Collins' daughters, which was really terrific, and talked a lot about her life as a writer and their memories of her. And she recorded several of her books herself. And we were like, talk about a trailblazer. Like Jackie Collins knew that people would want to listen to her reading her own book, but they were saying one of Jackie's niece, so I think their cousin, is now re-recording some of them because they were abridged. And it was really fascinating to think about. I mean, in the 90s, audiobooks didn't even really feel like it. They felt like an oddity almost.
Well, they were,
I think, in
very
some ways
expensive.
Like you'd maybe get them at the library in those like clamshell boxes.
The cassettes, I used to have to carry those library to library.
You needed like a suitcase just for one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was a suitcase. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember my actual suitcase not making it on one of those trips. Like it was stuck in another airport. And I went from library to library. I'm like, here I am in my weekend jeans and whatnot. And the only case I have is cassettes. Would you like some? Honestly, it was the best day of sales I ever had. Just you go in, you're like, so sorry, I get like this.
I had a talking point.
Oh yeah, and I actually had come from Audiophile's lobster bake, and I was wearing the clothes that I had worn to the lobster bake, so I smelled like lobster. Maybe that was attractive.
Lobster's delicious.
Yeah, exactly. Fine. It worked.
Works
it worked
for me.
really well.
That's like real romance hero stuff, right?
Oh, totally.
She smelled like lobster and cassette tapes.
So away from lobsters for a moment, Michele, can you talk a little bit about how reviews are? It sounds, well, let me put it this way, Jennifer. It sounds like because Kirkus is really only writing reviews for traditionally published books, I'm imagining the publishers are sending in the books, making a request or something. I'm curious for Audiofile Magazine. We haven't really heard a bit about, is it all traditional publishing? Is it some indie? Is it a mix? And if it is a mix or whatever it is, how do they end up in the magazine?
Sure. So it's definitely a mix. We obviously meet with publishers on a regular basis to find out what's coming up. We have submissions from narrators, from independent authors, from the publishers, and it's very actually easy to submit as an independent author. If your title's already up on Audible, you just send a link to the title on Audible, no code required, to editor@audiofilemagazine.com and say a little bit about why you think it should be reviewed. So the editors are taking these literally thousands of submissions each month and curating those lists. And so they're taking a look at, what is being talked about on social media, what is being talked about in the press, what they are, seeing reviewed in advanced reading copy reviews, and kind of curating those lists down and then offering reviewers, here's a smaller list of things that you can choose from. So we really are taking a lot of recommendations from people involved with the titles themselves, as well as trying the editors really try to keep their finger on the beat of many different genres. We're reviewing business and romance and children's and YA. So it's a lot of sourcing of the variety of titles coming in and then taking a look at who the narrator is, what they, how big is the book expected to be? When do we receive the advanced review copy? All of that can go into the mix of deciding.
And so I'm curious does it matter who the sender is? Does it make any difference if it's traditional published? Does one thing hold more weight than the other?
No, obviously the traditional publishers meeting with our editors and walking them through the titles like on a quarterly basis is really helpful because they've got such big lists. But it really doesn't matter who is submitting it. The editors curate it and then the reviewers have the choice. So the reviewers are influenced by, they might see something on social media or have heard about a book that's coming out, or they might have an interest in a particular topic. And the editors say, hey, we know that you are very much interested in celebrity autobiographies. Like, here's a new one. Would you like to review this? So it's a lot of give and take between the reviewers and the editors trying to, winnow these lists down from the thousands and thousands submitted to the hundreds reviewed each month.
And as the editors are looking through all this plethora of emails, is there a trend on what makes a particular title or email stand out, just for our listeners today who might be wanting to send in their own books, or is there something they can do to stand out more?
I would say don't write a book about your book. Short and sweet is always going to be helpful. If you are working with, a professional narrator who is well known, having them submit never hurts, because it's like, oh, they read a lot of titles. And if they're saying this is something that you should pay attention to, that's always really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And just trying to identify the key reasons, not so much about the story, but why is the audio special? What did this narrator do that's different? How did these two narrators interact in a unique way? So remembering that, yes, we are all going to be exposed to and care about the text, but it's the performance ultimately that is going to be considered in an important way. So for narrators, I always say, if you recorded 4 books that month, don't send all 4, right? Send the one that you feel is really special.
Mm-hmm. Is there, again, specifically for narrators that are listening, because we do record so much, it's not quite the same for authors, for an indie author. It's probably more akin to a publishing house, right? The number of titles that we could offer up at any time for review. Is there a frequency? Like, how do you choose? How much should you hold back before you send a review?
I think it's, you really go for the ones that spoke to you in some way, and that you feel when it speaks to you that you've given a really special performance.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, if you record 200 books a year, what are the 8 of those that really you thought you shined in, not the 80?
Right. Mm-hmm. And Jennifer, I know you don't select the books, and you are not part of the editing team, you're a reviewer, but do you have any insights about how books come your way? I know you said you don't choose them yourself.
So I don't.
Than Audiofile.
And I would, again, this is not necessarily like, I don't want to speak for my editor, but I like, I get the magazine and I look at it, right? And I would say, like, one of the things that is clear to me as a reader of romance is how hard Lori, my editor, is trying to, like, sort of get a selection of books. So the magazine comes out like twice a month. And let's say there are maybe, I don't know, 5 to 7 or 8 romance reviews each magazine. I'm like spacing out. Sorry. I'm like each episode, but I'm like, that's a podcast. So, if it's like 15 titles a month, right? I think what's clear to me is that Lori is really trying to get like some rom-coms, some historical romance, right? So, sort of like, there's only a limited number, right? To like make sure it's as diverse or inclusive as possible, right? To like, if there's paranormal or, so I think her goal, it seems to me, because I can sort of tell when I look at it, is she wants to be able to say, like, Kirkus is reviewing romance that is like, we're not just doing rom-coms. And so there's some, there's different publishing houses. So, excuse me. So she's trying to get Berkeley and Avon and Source Books, right? So I think it's like my take on it is it's almost like a big game of Tetris. And so it's like trying to be as like broad as possible about getting, eat as many books as possible from across subgenres, across publishers, right? And so that you're really appealing at some level to like every kind of reader.
And I see Michele, I see you nodding along. It seems like maybe that's familiar to you too.
Definitely. And it's funny because I'm not on the editorial team. Like I'm on the sales and marketing side, but we meet frequently, and we have a romance, section, Tease, and Caitlin Augusta, who really leads that. It's always fun to hear her talk about the different romances. And, I just think it's too bad that there's not unlimited time and that we could read and listen to everything. So I'm sure it's challenging for the reviewers to select what they're going to listen to each month. Yeah. I know for me, I have to listen to 5 books a month for the podcast. And, sometimes that might mean I listen to 10 or listen to pieces of 10 before I'm like, ooh, these are the 5 I really want to go to. So in the same way, when you're submitting, like pick the ones that really speak to you. I try to do that from the other side of picking the ones that really speak to me when I'm talking about them.
I just want to point out, everybody, there is a really cool, it's called Audio Gals. and they only review romance audiobooks.
Yes.
And it's a blog, I think. And a friend of mine that I follow on Twitter reviews for them. And my understanding is that that's like a little more self-directed, right? Like, I just wanted to review this one. But I do think that readers love audiobooks. Romance readers love audiobooks. So I think there's more and more kind of places to maybe find people that are doing what Audiofile does really well, which is saying like, this performance is really worth your time and attention.
Yeah, and that's such an important distinction. I'm so glad you said that before, Michele, of when you're bragging about your book, that really to focus on the audio element of it. It's a really good reminder, I think, for anyone who's submitting that this isn't just, there are lots of places to get books reviewed. There are many fewer places to get audiobooks reviewed. And to really highlight that element. Though I do wonder, as a narrator, that does feel a little hard if if an author, publisher, whoever is suggesting that I also send in a request to have something reviewed, to be like, well, let me tell you about my fabulous performance in this book.
Well, if you're coming from the major audio publishers, they're submitting everything, so
Right.
you don't need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're working with an independent author that you feel this is really good, and this is their first or second or third audiobook, like that's great. And you have a relationship with Audiophile, definitely. And I know for me, when I'm trying to choose books for the podcast, I will sometimes say to my narrator friends, it's like, have you heard about anything good? Or what's that? I have production houses that will text me and be like, oh, you really got to keep an ear out for this. This is really good. So be sure that you try to pull that off the pile when it comes to your titles. And of course, I tend to do a lot of the celebrity autobiographies, because then I'm not insulting anyone I know if I don't.
Prince Harry is fine if you weren't a fan.
Exactly. Prince Harry. Oh.
Yeah.
I think the other, I just want to say, like, in terms of like audiobooks in particular, in romance, I think there's a lot of, maybe it's just all readers, but like romance readers, I know the best. And like, people have really strong feelings, right? And so, like, do you want a dual narrator or not, right? Like, some people are fine with it in contemporary, but feel it is wrong in historical, or, right? So like, I have a favorite audiobook narrator who does historical, Mary Jane Wells. Yep. And, someone was like, yes, but I didn't like her blah, blah accent. And I was like, you are really way beyond me. But I think that that's one of the reasons in particular, I think of romance as being, we were talking before it started, it's a very personal genre,
yes.
Right? It is about your feelings as a reader, reading about these people's feelings. And I think that there are ways in which when audio doesn't work for romance, it really is like wrong, And so I think that, it just, because it's so personal. I mean, my all-time favorite book has a narrator I don't like. So I've never listened to it in audio, because I'm just like, I can't. You know what I mean? I literally am like, can we crowdsource? Can we get Mary Jane Wells to do it? Like, what would it take? So I do think that in particular, romance listeners really feel, I don't know, there's something very primal about the way they feel about the way these narrators.
For sure.
There is so much connection. And I think you talk about that, there's duet and dual narration where they, it's either every other chapter. So you get those two perspectives. That's something that's done in romance more than in the rest of audio. Yeah. Or you have the characters actually interacting. So all of the dialogue from the female is done by the female narrator. So I think that helps build the connection. And romance and erotica are so intimate. Yeah. You really feel like you get to know the character of the narrator in some way as well. And I've been to a number of romance conferences, for book readers and consumers, and they're always like, they go after those men as male narrators at the romance conferences. Look out, because you can hear that deep growly voice. He's been taking off his shirt and
listen, I'm simple that way.
Yeah. Yeah. The female narrators are the best friends of the, feel like more like friends, I think. And I think a lot of us spend a lot of time really getting to know the community of listeners. So folks get excited to meet in person, and we're excited to meet them in person too, because we've built this connection, and it does often feel like the men are more like traditional celebrity fan relationship, maybe.
Yes, because you're a rival in some way, right? So if you are, there with Joe Arden, right? The person wants to meet him because you've been,
Right.
if you're the female narrator, you've been their rival, you've been their competition,
Right. Right. Yeah. I'm curious. We've spent a lot of time talking about reviews, how the reviews happen, how you get a review to be a certain title to be reviewed. Michele, I feel like perhaps you might have an answer to this question. Do you have any data or information you can share about what happens after the impact of being reviewed? Do you see a change in sales because of that in a publication like Audiofile Magazine versus, a bunch of folks on their personal blogs, which are now on Instagram? Is there a way to track that? Do you have any information you can share with us about that?
We don't do the sales. So, I don't get any sales data from anyone that takes advertising or any of that. What I do know is that we have lots of repeat, whether it's, independent authors taking something in our indie pub showcase, which is designed for the independent author. You don't have to make any ad. You just have your materials that exist, your cover art, descriptions. People advertise again and again, and the same on the traditional publisher side. So, our list of over 75,000 emails every week is getting recommendations. So if you want to be seen by the people who are power listeners, it's really the place to be. I can't say what translates into sales. I just know people come back and advertise over and over.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty good sign of something must be going well.
And to be clear, we don't do paid reviews. So you can't pay us to review your title.
Which I think is a difference with Kirkus, right? Do you know, Jen, if that's
so
true? I like that on the website.
I know. I'm like, here, I'm okay. I'm going to say this, but I'm not sure I'm right. Actually, you know what? I don't know. So I'm not going to say it. I do think it is possible for some people to pay for a review, and I think they're clearly marked, but I don't actually know. I think I know, but I don't want to say it wrong, so I'm not going to guess.
Okay, that's fair.
But and here's what if I can answer your question too.
Yeah.
I don't know if Kirkus could have any impact on sales or would know, because they are putting out reviews so far in advance of their publication dates. And it's also not really their goal necessarily, right? Like their product is for readers and librarians. But on Fated Mates, we actually can often tell if we are moving sales for a book, because when we talk about a book on the podcast, if it's not, it's release week, right? If it's release week, obviously any number of things are propelling that book's sales. But if we just pluck a book out of obscurity and talk about it one week, sometimes we'll have authors say I saw a huge spike in sales, right? Because I was on Fated Mates, or I could figure out why I was all of a sudden have this spike in sales, especially for self-published authors, because they can see real time data from Amazon. That's essentially what they're selling. So I do think that we have had influence that way. It's not TikTok level influence. I wouldn't say that. But I do think we also do advertising. We sort of run our own advertising program. And it's essentially one of the few places romance authors can advertise is Fated Mates. And so in that it's very clear that it's an advertisement. I think when that big hockey thing happened in TikTok, it became clear that there were TikTokers who were doing paid advertisement and not saying that. Right. And we have also had a lot of repeat business where people are look, we know that your audience of, however many thousands of people, they are romance readers, and you can put, my book right into their space. So, in that sense, and, we don't judge that your cover's too racy or whatever. We just want to talk about romance. So we do get some information from readers that like talking about their books on the podcast, either as an advertisement or just because we talked about it, will increase sales for them.
Wow.
Yeah.
That must feel pretty good to know that you're
It
having that kind of an
It
impact.
really does. Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing feeling. And I think there are books that feels like we were early champions of that then sort of, it feels a little like we, I don't know, like got the snowball rolling down the hill and it picked up a lot of traction and a lot of other people heard about it. And that's also a pretty cool feeling.
Wow.
My favorite thing I will say is Audiophile distributes into airport lounges.
I've seen them.
And so I travel a lot. And when I fly internationally, I'm able to have access to a lounge. So it's always fun to be in a lounge watching someone read the magazine and then talking to them about, what's influencing your choices. What do you listen to? That's really fun for me. So I don't know how much that impacts any one book sale, but gives me a lot of insights.
Yeah. We've sort of touched on like the trend. How do I put this? I guess, Jen, you're making me think with referencing TikTok. Obviously, there are books, authors, narrators that start to trend in social media, and readers get really interested in getting as much content from those folks as possible. For either of you, in any of the various places that you are supporting reviews or marketing or love for books out in the world, does that ever become a factor? Is any of that work ever influenced by some of those trends? Or if it's not necessarily a social media trend, just a really popular, let's say for narrators, like a really popular narrator that's a household name. Michele, I heard you reference before, like if a really popular narrator is on a title, sometimes it's helpful to have them vouch for the book as well. Are there other ways in which those known entities are influencing some of the work that you all either directly are propping up or just through the various places where you work?
Well, definitely, as we look at titles that we review, we will often reach out to the narrator to ask for a little video about the title as well. So, we're putting it out on social, we're putting the review out in the magazine, online. We might be talking about it on the podcast, and then also having a little video. All of these elements together and the repeated way in which you are placing that title into the ether through both artists, through the author and the narrator, are very supportive of titles. So that's, I think, an important thing to consider if you're making an audiobook, especially if you're an independent author. Work with your narrator if they're willing to do a short video to talk about it and put that content out there. And I think the thing that we forget with audio is that it's its own format. So you can use a clip of the audio for lots of different things. So do a little headliner video, do a video about yourself talking about the process. In any discussion of social media these days, video is super important. So even if you just have the audio, you can create a video with that. So take the time to do that. It's very inexpensive and it can be a way to get your title seen.
Interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess I would say not really in some ways, right? I mean, like the way we talk about audio on Fated Mates is definitely like, I'm more of a listener than Sarah is. And I think part of it is as an author, Sarah, I think her relationship with her own audiobooks is complex, right? I mean, she's like, I could never listen to my own book in audio. But like, I think that here's what I will say, like an author we really love on the podcast is a woman named Kylie Scott. She uses the same narrator, Andy Arndt, every time. And I love Andy's books. I love Andy's narration. And there's a way, I think, in which there's like a synchronicity when you have an author and like who has like a really strong audiobook partner. Another good example is Molly Harper and Amanda Rinconi, right? Like they go together like peanut butter and jelly. Like, people love these two. Our first season was all the Immortals After Dark series by Cressley Cole. They were all narrated by Robert Peckoff. And so I do think that there's a way in which like Mary Jane Wells or right there are kind of favorites on the podcast because these are authors we love, right? So we love these narrators, and that does tend to take on almost like a life of itself. But I wouldn't say that we at this point are really it's just like a byproduct. I don't think we're that purposeful or intentional.
Mm.
Funny, I stayed at Andy Arndt's house last week, and
I talk about comfort listens.
Yeah, it's great.
Everybody, there's a book called Lead, Jimmy Ferris. I have listened to that audiobook 10 times probably.
Wow.
I love it. It's great.
It sounds like I'm hearing like there's a little bit of a give and take, right? Like, Michele, you were describing creating your own videos if you are someone who's marketing an audiobook and doing all these things that get the book attention can also help to then get it a review in Audiofile Magazine. What about the next level of those reviews? So an earphone award, eventually for narrators, getting recognized as a golden voice. In Kirkus Reviews, it's a Kirkus Star, right? And then there's an award as well.
It's happening tonight right now.
Oh, right. Which is so funny.
Yeah.
Somehow we missed
I was like, we should have my editor on. And then I was like, well, it's the Kirkus Awards. It's a good day,
not a good day for that. What makes for that distinction? How does a book rise to that point? And it seems that I was going to say that the give and take or the push and pull of it seems that if a book is to rise to an earphone award level, perhaps that gives it another boost that it would, in sales. So is it a book that already was giving itself a sort of social media boost and then got this other one, what is the cycle there, I guess? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think so. Earphones Awards are basically all of the reviewers, as they listen to something, they can say, I think this is one of, the top ones. So I'm recommending it for an earphone award. And then the editors will choose to bestow it based on criteria I don't know. Yeah, that can definitely help. The other thing that happens is that Audiophile works with a lot of different places where because we are one of the fewer audiobook review sources, will work with LitHub to have a list of audiobooks for them, or with the Millions. And so a lot of the titles that are being selected for Earphones Awards are getting extra distribution of the review to a variety of our different partners as well. So that can help the visibility beyond just the audiophile circle, but within other spaces within the book space as well. And then Golden Voices doesn't really have an impact because that's a voice, or that's an award specifically for the narrator and for their body of work over a lifetime. So it's not tied into any one title. But what we do in our December-January issue is have the best of the year. So that's a short list of titles that we are recommending as the cream of the crop from that particular year. And that's another place, if your book came out in February, but it's getting best of the year, it's another opportunity for it to, be in front of more eyes. And that's an issue, having worked selling audiobooks in the public library space for years, you'd see that December-January audiophile issue on every librarian's desk for an entire year until the next one came in.
And we're talking about titles and the boost that these awards and things can give to the title, but what about the narrators themselves? So I know, like the golden voice, well, it may be, over a course of someone's career, I imagine does give some sort of a boost to the future of their career from that point forward, perhaps. Or having received an earphone award or a number of earphone awards, you see a lot of similar voices coming up over and over again for those things. And obviously some of that is because they're great at what they do, but, a lot of people are great at what they do. What is the distinction there? And if you can identify one, and perhaps you can't, but also what I guess I'm curious if Audiophile, as we were talking about the beginning of this conversation, sort of what's the aim for Audiophile with reviews? Is there an aim with having those awards, those recognitions? Do you feel like it has an impact? And do you feel like there is, I don't know, a certain responsibility, I guess, to the folks that are reading the publication, because they're putting a lot of faith in, like, oh, I trust these opinions and I'm going to follow them. Any thoughts about that? That's a little garbled, but hopefully you understood my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that highlights something as special to the consumer is important. So that's where those Earphones Awards come in with each issue and each week. On our website, you can see what the latest earphones were. So that only helps things. I mean, when it comes to selecting a narrator as an independent author, I think that's where the decision point is super important. And that's where it's going to help you if you've picked a great narrator for the book who's a professional and who has done this and who really has something special that can connect with your title, then it becomes a title that is really more likely to get in earphones, more likely to get, audio awards, things like that. And that all helps raise the profile. So selecting a good narrator as part of your process is always going to help your book. And when I went to public libraries for more than a decade, you'd go into any public library and you talk to librarians about what they're thinking about and what their listeners were thinking about. And it's oftentimes, I love Scott Brick. I love, Tavia Gilbert. And I'm going to listen to whatever they read. Right. So it can, the right narrator can help expose your title to people that wouldn't necessarily listen. Like for me, I don't like to read with my eyes nonfiction. So I will listen to a lot more nonfiction than I will read with my eyes. And I will often make a choice. I'm not sure I'm that interested in the subject, but look, it's Hillary Huber, it's Vikas Adam. I'm going to try that because I trust their voice. Right. And I know that I will have a good experience, even if the topic isn't really my thing. So it's a little earlier in the process. It'll help all of those. It's like dominoes, kick them over.
And this is, I guess, a follow-up to that. And this is a question for you as well, Jennifer. I think in particular with Fated Mates, all of these narrators that you're mentioning who are all fabulous are all started somewhere. And we have such a huge slew of new narrators coming in all the time. With Audiophile and with Fated Mates, is there any feeling of, well, we have this opportunity to raise up new voices, whether it's authors, and I mean, I'm talking about narrators now, but I suppose the same goes for authors. And Jennifer, you spoke to this a little bit with Kirkus, which wasn't necessarily specifically about newer writers, but trying to plan out a diversity of entries into the publication. Can either both of you speak a little bit about what efforts there are to highlight newer voices, either writers or narrators or both, either through Earphone Awards or just reviews, or what's being done about bringing new folks to the attention of readers and listeners?
I mean, I think one of the things that's really tricky is that romance is so vast. I mean, like, it is oceans of books, and now self-publishing. There's no, it's great. There's no gatekeeping, but that also means there's no gatekeeping. Right. And so, the number of books is just so massive. Right. And I think in a lot of ways, it's what's really interesting in the romance space is that traditional publishing is far more, circumspect. I think there's less risk taking in that space. And so what we're really seeing now is something very interesting, which is if a book hits big through TikTok or on KU, what you're seeing now is then traditional publishing swooping in and buying it and then like putting it out in paperback and putting out an audio version of a book that has already been out and like has found a readership. And I think there's something strange about that to me. I'll be honest. I've used the analogy. It's like eating seed corn. Like, because I'm kind of like, well, what happens when that pipeline closes, right? TikTok is going to become its own publisher. And so is TikTok only going to start talking about TikTok books? You know what I mean? And so it's like really interesting to sort of see that happening. But I think one of the things that we try very hard to do, and, you can only read so much, is to really try every week to that our podcast comes out every week, to talk about an author every week that we've never mentioned before. And that is very easy to do. And even if we did that, we would still never run out of authors to talk about. So I do think we think of it as a responsibility, and not in a way like nobody's taking medicine. These are great authors, but it's just like finding those authors and like sort of talking about them. So it is something we think of as being really important because romance is so vast and so expansive.
Yeah.
But it is also overwhelming. Like sometimes I'm like, I just want to read something like I know and love.
Something tried and true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, from the narrator side, there's a lot of new voices coming into the space. And, we're trying to review some of the people that have been around forever and some of the people that are coming into space. And it's, it happens every day that people get their first review,
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine it must be, I just keep thinking about the sheer number of entries you get and how hard that must be, and all the things that do need to be balanced, just like the list of things that Jennifer mentioned before. I'm sure that's and I see it, you see it in the magazine, the different categories, and you don't want one category to be this big and one to be this big. So I imagine that is part of the balance. And I just don't envy all those editors and reviewers trying to pare it down, for sure.
I mean, the good thing is that the print magazine can only take so many, but the internet, the website can take a lot more.
Yeah.
So we do have the opportunity to review more from having a website, and that, the magazine's been around for more than 30 years. So it's, it's taken a while to get there. The first iteration of it was literally a pamphlet that was for librarians. And poor Robin Whitten, who's the founder, she talked to people in the industry about it, and they're like, it's a terrible idea. And, 30 years later.
It's still going. Yeah, I wonder if folks know that there are more reviews online than maybe what they're seeing in print. Thank you for mentioning that, because that feels important to make clear too. And actually, speaking of online, the online version of Audiofile, I'm curious, something that some folks may not know is that there's this narrator database on there as well. So it's sort of a resource. The website is not just reviews. It's also serves as a resource. Is there a connection with how do narrators get listed there, for folks who don't know? And is there a connection with the narrators that are listed and those that end up in reviews? And I think there's also another distinction as well. I know there's like the guide, and then there's some other list of narrators. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences between those things?
Sure. So there's the sort of featured narrators that it's a fully editorial selection, and you need to have a certain number of reviews. They look at that. So once you've had a certain number of reviews, you're more eligible for those editorial pages. You can definitely request those, but that's really editorial selection. The talent guide is a paid placement for narrators to have their title or their, profile, and it's, I guess, the correct word. And that's really a professional resource for independent authors, for producers, for publishers to go and be able to search. So when I say, okay, I don't know anyone off the top of my head who can do a really good Russian accent, I can put in Russian, people come up, and then I can take I didn't know that person did Russian, So there's that. And, it won't hurt you to have a guide listing to get a review at all. That's certainly something that it's more to be supportive of the magazine, but also to be supportive of your career. But the editorial selection is a bit different.
I will say, as a narrator, I have had, I have had producers reach out to me because they found me, they knew me already, but exactly what you just described. They were looking for a particular skill set, and they went there to look for someone who has that skill set and they said, oh, I didn't realize you did that, and called me. So that is a really helpful tool because there's a handful of places to go, but you kind of have to go individually to different production companies, mostly that and audiobook publishers who have websites and list their narrators to find everyone.
Yeah.
And it doesn't tell you how to find them. So like when you come to Audiophile's, professional guide, you can say, okay, here's their website, here's their email, here's some samples from them that they have chosen. Here's what they look like, because I'm always thinking about what someone looks like when I'm casting.
I mean, I have no idea what Andy Arndt looks like, everybody, but he seems super cool.
Well, she's a lovely human, regardless of her, visage, which is lovely as well.
Yes. And I think that is important we have all sorts of folks who listen into this podcast. Many are authors, we have producers. And so if you don't know, that is a really helpful tool, like to know that there's this database where you can search by need different types of skill sets.
I'm going to be telling everybody about it on Fated Mates, everyone. So don't worry about it.
And I will tell you, we just launched, the Voices to Know Sound Talent e-newsletter. So that is for people who have a guide listing and they get highlighted. And we're going to do that quarterly, going out to the publishers and producers. So that's a way to say, ooh, look at these people. They got earphones awards. So,
is it only folks that have received a review? Because not everyone in that guide, unless I'm right? Is this the paid guide, not the featured guide? Yeah.
Right. Yes,
so not everyone in that guide has necessarily received a review.
That is true. Yeah.
In what you were just talking about, is that just highlighting folks that have been reviewed or received awards, not folks that are just on the list?
People that have been reviewed. Yes.
Okay.
So keep working hard and send your titles in so that they get potentially reviewed. Our editor, Jen Dowell, is going to kill me tomorrow. She's like, how? 400.
I just think from our perspective on Fated Mates, audio is booming, right? I know it is everywhere. And I just think that there are so many people are kind of out there kind of figuring it out on their own. And I don't often think they even know the full extent of the resources that are available. I mean, I get really overwhelmed sometimes just scrolling through Audible or Hoopla. And so it is, on our Patreon, we have a whole channel about audio because so many people just really love audio, love romance and audio. And nobody reads like romance readers, whether it's with their eyes or their ears. And so I think it's really been fascinating to think about this, and if we don't really review audio, and now I'm thinking we totally should. What are we doing? Wasted opportunity. We're going to cut in on your business, Michele.
Well, from the Audio Publishers Association perspective, it's been 11 years of double-digit growth in audiobook revenue. And what genre has been really shooting up the last couple of years. I wonder why. Could it have been the pandemic when people stopped going out on dates? It is romance, in fact, has taken huge leaps and bounds in the audio genre because people really, you needed a friend in the pandemic. Maybe got a little sick of your husband in the pandemic. I don't know.
You need somebody directly in your ears delivering you stories where everybody ends up happy.
And we all deserve that.
Yeah.
Right. I do consider Dion Graham my boyfriend, and he knows it. We talk about it all the time. I am his type A girlfriend, and it was great during the pandemic. I couldn't see him in person. I could, however, lay around and listen to him.
Yeah. And along with that rise in interest in listening, there's been, as we were talking about before, just so many new voices, both and as authors and narrators. It's a huge, keeps rising as well.
It's so funny. I remember being at conferences 10 years ago, and I could name every person who walked in the door and got their badge. I knew who they were. And now I'm there's so many people narrating audiobooks that it's really great. I'm meeting all these fantastic new people. I can't put a name to every face immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Well, can you put a name to every voice, though?
Oh, interesting.
It is funny. I'm not a big, when I, imbibe television, I'm not usually looking at it,
Yeah.
but every time I hear a voice I know, they're always, an audiobook narrator. I'm like, oh, that's Nick Sullivan. That's, you can tell them. And then I'll go look at the screen like, aha, there it is. Barbara
I mean, that
Rosenblatt.
voice is so powerful. I've been re-listening to this Kate Daniels series and like graphic audio, which
Yes.
is like, and like the guy who does Curran's voice, I'm like basically in it for him. And I'm just like, but it's also, I mean, I'm a big rereader, and I just find like rereading an audio to be such a pleasure, right? Like I'm just really like, it's like the experience you have when you like see a friend you haven't seen in 10 years, like in your car driving to work.
Very comforting. It's the comfort food of books.
Yes. Well, I took a bath in it earlier. So
Yes.
I always feel like I make new friends. Like I just listened to Eric Thomas's book of essays, and I was like, we're friends now. I know that, next time I see him at some book thing, I'm going to be like, hey, when we were having a drink when I was walking through my neighborhood, drinking a glass of wine with you. You didn't know this, but.
Oh my gosh. Well, this has been such an informative conversation. I do want to kind of wrap things up, but I thought maybe we'd end on you sharing, we've talked so much about influencing readers, sharing information with readers, both eyeball readers and ear readers. I'm curious what influences the both of you. Where do you turn for your content? How do you find the books that you listen to, that you read? What are your influences? Perhaps we can inspire some of our listeners today to turn to whatever you do.
It's funny because I turn to the editors of Audiofile and say, what do you suggest that I would like to listen to this month?
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of times narrators will say to me, oh, you really should take a listen to this. And not all of those do end up on the podcast, but it's really that curated list coming to me. We know you like all the weird books, Michele. So here's the weird books. Or we really like a theme. My next week is Halloween. So they try to give me all murder books. And then I'm like, but I also want Jada Pinkett Smith, which turns out she talks about the murder of Tupac Shakur. So it's on my theme.
Mm-hmm.
But I really do turn to the editors for help.
One of the reasons I continue to review for Kirkus is because I am always being assigned books I might not have otherwise read.
Yeah.
So like for me as a reviewer, it's not like I'm not doing it really for the money. I'm doing it because it's like a great way to stay current with the genre. So, I review 2 or maybe 3 books a month. And that, like at the end of the year, often adds up to 25 or 30 books I would not have otherwise read.
Yeah.
So a big value for me as a reviewer is just being assigned books by someone else that I would not have read. And I have found many books that I have then later, you wouldn't know because I can't talk about it, go on to talk about it on Fated Mates, that I love these books because I might have reviewed them for Kirkus. So that is like one of the big reasons I keep reviewing that. And I love Lori. Like Lori, whatever Lori wants from me, I'm going to give her. So that is like I find value in reviewing because it pushes you outside of your own personal like comfort zone. And then I would say like we have a really robust listenership, and that we have lots of people who are like, you would love this, or would recommend this. So for me, it's always trying to just like kind of get as many recommendations from as many different kinds of people as possible. But the real value added for me personally as a reviewer is being forced to read things I wouldn't have otherwise read.
So what I'm hearing is to influence others, what your influences are, become a reviewer, have a podcast, and folks will start to tell you what to read. And actually that does lead me, I said that was my final question, but it leads me to another final question. Where can folks go to learn about becoming a reviewer for Audiofile? And I don't know, Jen, if you can answer this for Kirkus, because you had a specific entry point, but do you know what the standard path is?
I do. Sometimes Lori asks me for reviewers and I will but I mean, they have to be written, right? So now I often will say, well, like I read this person's reviews on Goodreads.
Mm-hmm.
There are still some blogs, right? So, if you are interested in reviewing for Kirkus, review somewhere, right? Like, I mean, even if it's on your own Goodreads page. And then you just sort of, and I think Lori is constantly looking for people. So I do think there's sort of some kind of like give and take, like it helped, you're like, Jen, I want to review. But I mean, I do think that that's kind of, I wonder what's going to happen, right, for her finding people. But that's like the primary way is you are doing it elsewhere and you kind of have a track record that she can see and say, hey, this looks really great. And I think this is a person who could review for Kirkus.
Yeah. And for Audiofile, you, of course, have to be an audiobook listener. That's number one. And, you have to be a good writer. So you can send a writing sample to editor@audiofilemagazine.com and, show and talk about, obviously also talk about your listening practices, because you will have to listen to a lot.
Great. Thank you both so much. I learned a ton. I know our listeners did as well. I'm going to bring Samantha back on to close us out, but we're so appreciative to the both of you for spending your evening with us and sharing this wealth of information. That's really informative. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for the 4th Rosemoor Roundtable. You can follow today's guests at the following links. You can follow Jen at Jen Reads Romance on Instagram, or follow her on the Fated Mates website, www.fatedmates.net, or her personal site, jenreadsromance.com. You can follow Audiophile online at Audiofile Magazine on Instagram and Facebook, and at Audiofile Mag on X. To follow the APA, you can follow at Audiobooks on Instagram and X, and at Audiobook Community on Facebook. Audiophile has a daily review podcast called Behind the Mic, available at audiofilemagazine.com/podcast. To keep up with what's next on the Rosemoor Roundtable, you can subscribe to this podcast on the app you're listening to now, or follow myself, Samantha Brentmore, at Ms_Brentmore, or Rose Dioro at Rose Dioro VO on your social media platform of choice, where we will both enthusiastically be promoting the next discussion. Thank you to Bricktop Audio, our producer and distributor for the podcast, and thank you for listening. See you next time.